Hey everyone, it's me HawkeyeG, and I'm here with another video for you. Today I'm continuing my series on army composition creation, teaching you how to build and compose your own armies from scratch. In this video, I'll be focusing on the different lord and hero types you will come across in the game, and what the best ways are to select the best lord type for you and incorporate the appropriate hero types into your composition as well. I'll be breaking down how to prioritize your selections, what the advantages and disadvantages of different options are, and how to make adjustments based on your own playstyle. This is focused on generic lord types rather than legendary lords because I think advice for those would fit more into faction-specific videos. This is meant more for figuring out how to best build your own army composition aside from the legendary lord and what units might be specific to them, because in many cases a legendary lord's army will be unique. So this is meant to take a broader view of how lords and heroes can be generalized into different types, and then breaking down how to incorporate those into your army compositions for any race when you're planning those out. With that being said, let's get into the video. Of course, the first thing you have to choose when going to build an army is your lord. It's a little imperfect to generalize lords into universal types, but I'm going to classify most generic lords into the following types: melee lords, support lords, and Spellcaster Lords. There's other types which are more niche or can be a blend of these types. We might have ranged-based lords, or we might have melee magic hybrid lords, but I'll discuss those as well and explain how to understand them within these three basic classifications. Again, these are really meant to just be general classifications, and most of these lord types can be specialized depending on what you want to use them for. In addition, depending on which race you've chosen and which DLC you have purchased, your options to choose from will vary. Every race will have the option for a melee frontline type lord. Some of these are technically hybrid options, but besides that, most races will have two options, one being this melee type and then the other being some sort of ranged or spellcaster type of some sort. But even this is not a hard and fast rule. Like the Lizardmen, even with all DLC, effectively have only melee-focused generic lords, with one special exception, or the Vampire Coast, which only has hybrid types, either Spellcaster Melee or Spellcaster Melee range types. But we'll look at the three basic lord types I've established so far and try to give more definition to them by talking about how you can recognize them, what their purpose is, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and why you might use them. So the first category to discuss is the melee lord. I think these are usually pretty easy to recognize. Most of the time their title will be melee specialist, or melee something, melee this, sword infantry, sword and shield, etc. But besides this, you can also recognize them by their stat line. They'll usually have pretty high melee attack and high melee defense. And this part is important to note because I believe it's useful to help categorize hybrid lords as well. If we look at what kinds of stats they have and how those break down, it can help us classify these lords into different types. I say this because some support type characters can be melee types, can appear to be melee types as well, but we will discuss that more when we get to the support types. The purpose of the melee lord is pretty straightforward. They get into melee combat and fight. They'll often be best used against enemy infantry units, though in some cases targeting enemy heroes or lords can be effective with them as well. Their strength, of course, is that they are effective in melee. Especially as the lord of your army, it means they are less at risk from a variety of threats, but importantly, they won't be as susceptible to enemy heroes or specialty units targeting them directly. This means that they also don't require as much effort to use effectively or as much attention to keep alive. They also tend to have pretty good mount options, though sometimes mounts can be a double-edged sword. This also means that their greatest weakness is in their utility. While they will be really good at holding down an enemy unit and surviving, that's not the same effectiveness as a spellcaster who might kill or rout two good units with a single good spell. It's also difficult to use a melee lord to the maximum extent you might like to use a melee single entity for. You don't want to have your lord be overextended and risk putting yourself at a big disadvantage if something goes wrong, where with the melee hero you have more flexibility with that. So this means the number of potential combat opportunities that a melee lord gives you might be somewhat limited. The reason you would take them then is pretty much because of how they function. They can often deal good damage, and with a good mount and good micromanagement can be an effective fighting piece in multiple areas of the battlefield. They're also helpful if you're less confident in battle and want to reduce the risk of your lord dying. In general, they are good to ensure the survivability of your lord above all else. The next type is the support lord type, and it's a bit of a broader category that I'm using in this guide. It's going to encompass lords of different types and different natures in this game, but ultimately the point is that they're meant to be used and function in a similar fashion to each other, regardless of whether they have spells or not, or if they are a ranged unit or not. Like what their specific stats and what their, initial, like what their title is, hammer infantry, hybrid, whatever, that's not as important as the way that you use them in battle. Their stats typically won't quite measure up to what you'd expect on a normal melee lord, however. We can see if we compare this to this general of the Empire, has much higher melee attack. The general has a little bit worse melee defense, but that's kind of your clue, right? The support characters often have better melee defense than the increased melee attack that we see on a lot of the lords. Again, there's certain exceptions for certain races, but I find this to be a useful comparison to look at their stats and see that this Archlector for the Empire, for example, doesn't have as strong of melee stats, even though it's, hammer infantry. This isn't a spellcaster or a ranged type. It's still a melee type, but we can use these stats to help identify in many cases that this is probably a support character as opposed to a melee lord. Another primary indicator that you're dealing with a support lord type is actually within their skill tree itself. If we take a quick look at their skill tree here in game, we can see that this Archlector has a couple of additional skills on top of their standard baseline skills for the Lord. Looking at the Huntsman General, we're going to see more of the same thing. They're going to have a couple of additional skills on top of your standard skills that you would see for a standard Lord type. Again, here with the standard lord type, we can see they don't have any of these sort of additional skills. They just have the basic skill trees. Basically, another way to recognize them is when you look at their skill trees in game, you can kind of see some of these extra skills that they have. And so that, coupled with the stat lines that they have, are good indicators. They might be a little harder to recognize at first glance when you're looking at something I'd consider a support lord. But when comparing them to other lords by these kinds of metrics, it should be a bit clearer what you're looking at. In battle, their purpose is to support your own units. This can certainly vary from type to type. For example, we just looked at the Huntsman General and the Archlector skill tree. I would consider both of these to be support lords, especially relative to the General of the Empire, even though one of these is a ranged lord and the other one is technically a melee lord. The key is that they're given abilities which either help your units in battle or give you additional effects on the campaign map that other lords might not have access to. The melee type support lords in general are meant to help hold front lines and join in fights. The Archlector has skills which give buffs to nearby allied units, in addition to buffing themselves. So you want this to fight alongside other units. The Huntsman General has a little more of an indirect value. Certainly it can get some missile damage on some enemy units, and it has a couple of abilities, but as we saw in the brief skill tree preview there, a lot of their value comes from actually being able to enhance your abilities on the campaign map itself. And so instead of, directly impacting the battle as significantly or having their support skills be used in that way, they function as a support character that gives you an advantage ahead of the battle. So there's different ways they can operate, but the idea is that they're meant to work alongside your other units to achieve goals together, and use their campaign effects or battle abilities to give you a variety of advantages. So this means their strength is the ability to improve the power of your entire army as a whole. Whether this is in battle or on campaign, they are meant to have an impact on the army at large, rather than in individual battle encounters or objectives. However, this means their weakness is that they themselves may not have as direct an impact on the battle. Again, comparing to spellcaster types, these support lords won't often be doing damage all by themselves. They do often require other units to get involved. They also tend to be a little bit weaker in melee combat than the melee lords. Especially with this ranged support type, you may find them in grave danger if the enemy brings some sort of flying single entity or a lord or hero on a mount to battle them. So they're a bit more vulnerable, and they don't individually get as good of a value in battle all on their own. However, I still think they're often worth picking because of how they can shift things into your favor in various ways. I believe they're often a good selection for a more experienced player who can manage the flow of battle effectively, although some of them may offer good campaign effects that can help inexperienced players as well. These lords may also depend more heavily on your unit selection preference, or what heroes your race has available to it in order to support them correctly. The last main category to discuss is the Spellcaster Lord. These are typically easily recognizable, as they will have access to magic spells. Your melee and support lords will almost never have this. There are exceptions that I will talk about shortly, but in most cases we're talking about a lord type where they lack a melee skill tree for their personal abilities. You're also able to recognize them by their typically deficient melee abilities, especially in comparison to other melee lords that you have available in the roster. Their purpose in battle is to both deal damage to your enemies, as well as supporting and enhancing your allies. What exactly their purpose is does depend on which lore of magic you've selected. Some lean more heavily on defensive and support and healing spells, while others are more focused entirely on damage dealing or enhancing damage output of your allies. Which lore of magic you suggest is mostly up to you, as they're fairly well balanced, but it's worth investigating and experimenting for yourself to find which magic lores are best suited to your goals, or which ones can best help support your allies or defeat your enemies. The strength of these lords is that they can deal large amounts of damage and single-handedly shift the flow of battle very easily. While a melee lord can have a direct impact themselves, they have to get into melee. The Spellcaster Lord does not have to get into melee. In fact, it can affect multiple different areas of the battlefield with different spells because of the range on these spellcasts, as we can see here. You can reach several different parts of the battlefield in a very short time, only needing the casting duration of the spell to occur before you can reach from one side of the battlefield to another with multiple different effects. Spellcasters also typically get some sort of fast-moving mounts, whether it's a horse or a flying mount. It's very common for them to have good mobility as well. This, of course, means that their weakness is their overall low survivability. If an enemy melee lord or hero gets into direct combat with them, you'll be required to use some of your other units to support them sooner or later. You might survive for a bit if you're carefully managing your own buffs and spells, debuffs, healing, but generally that's not the most efficient use of those spells anyhow. This means that your Spellcaster Lord can be high risk but high reward. They deal lots of damage, but can't always get out of trouble easily. This is especially important to consider when we're talking about using them as a lord, because the lord's life or death will have a significant impact on the flow of a battle, more so than the hero's death will. You would choose this type if you're confident in your ability to use their spells well and keep them alive, or if you don't have access to a lot of spellcaster heroes yet, or just have more availability of other hero types to support the Spellcaster Lord. Or you might just choose them because they often can have the highest damage potential and impact on the battlefield. Now, before I move on to Lord selection type, I want to make two additional points to consider, and the first is the various hybrid Lord types that you'll encounter in the game. I decided not to make these their own category, in part to avoid confusion, but also in part because I think they can often be distilled into one of these three categories anyhow. So, using the Vampire Counts roster as an example, we can see a long list of hybrid melee / spellcaster type lords. We've got this Necromancer who has spells, and we've got a Strigoi Ghoul King with great melee stats who has spells, and we've got the Vampire Lord with great melee stats who has spells, so on and so forth, right? Even if you look at the bloodline lords like the Blood Dragon or the Von Karstein, like whatever bloodline lords you want to recruit as well, all of those are also going to have spells and melee stats. And so it can be kind of confusing, right? Like all of these lords are effectively hybrid melee spellcaster types. The Master Necromancer being the one exception. If you were to get into campaign, you would see these guys don't have a personal melee skill tree. So it's a bit confusing, right? Is this Ghoul King or the Vampire Lord, are they both melee? Is one melee, one spellcaster? Well, we can use the rules for sorting out other lord types and apply them here to make sense of what we're seeing. While most of these lord types do have a magic skill tree available to them, we can also see by looking at their stats that they ought to fall neatly into one of the three previous categories. This is a tool you can use to help sort out both lords and heroes into easier to understand archetypes when trying to figure out how to use them effectively and include them in your compositions. For these vampire lords, it seems pretty clear that many of them would categorize as melee lords. They're going to have high melee stats and survivability, and that means you probably can use a spellcaster hero to support them instead, so you don't have to worry about investing into their skill trees. In general, that's a good rule to follow for any sort of hybrid character, whether it's a lord or a hero. You want to specialize them into what they're good at, and then use that as an indicator of what other lord or hero selections you should make in order to fill whatever void that hybrid character is leaving behind. I will say that there's also some of these lord types which we might even classify as support types instead. Here again, we have to go to their skill tree to get the clue. And we can see for a Blood Dragon Vampire Lord, even though they would have good melee stats, they've also got some pretty interesting support abilities, where they can get heavily reduced upkeep and recruitment cost for different kinds of units, and the ability to boost them in different ways. So you might see some characters where these sorts of bonuses that might apply to some of their units, or might apply to some benefits on the campaign map, even if they have great melee stats and can themselves be potentially used as a melee hero in the end, you might still look at them as a support type or consider them for that role because of some of these additional bonuses that they can get. So, on the one hand, this does kind of demonstrate the shortcoming of my organizational categories. There's lots of unique lord types among the various races, and so you'll have to do a little experimenting on your own in the end to figure out exactly how each individual example will work. And with the increased skill point amount in Game 3, some of these lords will effectively function as both of their hybrid types at this point. The important part is, armed with the knowledge of how to identify what a lord is most likely to work best as, even if there's multiple options, being able to choose the most effective one with the information you have, and furthermore, even separating these support skills based on whether they require a lord's direct involvement in battle or can just take place on the campaign map or not. This will help you to identify their purpose, both how they should be used on the campaign map and how they should be used in battle for best effectiveness in your army. The other thing that I want to touch on before we move on is that there are many cases where your lord selection may be affected by the units you intend to put into that army. We've already seen a couple of examples via the Vampire Counts and the Empire. Many support lords have bonus skills for specific selected units. Some other examples are the Lizardmen with their red-crested skink chief characters, or the Croxagore Lord characters. We could also mention the Skaven Warlock Master, which is going to have some potential bonuses for weapons teams or for Doomflayers and Doom Wheels. Or the Master Assassin, which has a couple of little bonuses for Night Runners and Gutter Runners. There's even the High Elves and Dark Elves, where the High Elves, when you recruit, you can spend influence to get different traits. And as we can see here, some of these are upkeep reduction for specific units, or recruitment costs. You can see ammunition, different stuff like that. The Dark Elves, it works a little differently, where you unlock, a name of power to improve the army once you get to a certain point. But these are the sort of factors that might not be the most important factor when selecting which lord to use, but it is important to make yourself aware of them in advance, or at least how to know how to look for and recognize them. We can also see through these examples that these bonus traits can really apply to any of the lord types that I've laid out so far. It's also mostly the races from Game 2 that this applies to, though there are other examples as discussed. It's just another feature to keep in mind when making these sorts of decisions as to how to build your army. What lord type you want to use that fits your playstyle is the most important consideration to take into account, but if you're not sure, you can use whether or not they boost certain units as an additional consideration to take into account. So now that we've covered the various lord types in the game, let's talk about the different kinds of heroes you'll find and make use of. I find that these units will tend to have a more defined role than the lords, with a few exceptions. Part of this is the lord having skills for the campaign map and for boosting their army's stats on the red skill tree, while heroes just have their own personal skill trees. But many of these heroes will have support skills as well. And in fact, that's one thing I want to mention before anything else. When looking to select your hero type, it is of utmost importance to know which type provides the Casualty Replenishment bonus. I'll talk about this again later, but many races have a hero who has this Casualty Replenishment bonus. It increases the rate at which your army replenishes its casualties by a significant amount, especially as you level it up. Not all races have a hero which does this, but you want to make sure to find out if yours does. You are able to see if they have Casualty Replenishment when you're in the hero selection menu here. You have to toggle the hero details so you can see what their embed effect is. Or you can find it when you're looking at the army unit. You can see it in the building browser menu. And of course, you can see it on their skill tree page. Casualty Replenishment is the strongest feature, in my opinion, in the entire game. Having it changes your ability to retain momentum entirely, but this is kind of getting more into the selection of heroes section, which I'll mention it again when we get there. However, it's time to move on to identifying and explaining hero types now. So in the same vein as Lords, we are going to have three main categories of heroes. These are Melee Hero, Spellcaster Hero, and Support Hero. Now, there are some exceptions. There's a lot more variety in heroes than there are in Lords in this game, and it really depends on which race you're playing as, what sort of functions they can serve. Again, we talked about this with Support Lords, where support heroes may have different literal functions in battle or in campaign, but the way that you use them, or the goal that they're meant to achieve, is going to be the same across all races. There are even some kind of subcategories that I'm going to separate heroes into to try to create somewhat more meaningful definitions for them, but overall at the top level, we're still going to stick with those original three categories. Lastly, I don't mean to gloss over the campaign map abilities for heroes here. It's just not really the focus of this guide, and it's another thing that I don't want to get too deep into. I'm focused on how to incorporate heroes into your army in order to increase its effectiveness in battle and help you decide when and where to use them. So please don't overlook the campaign map abilities heroes have. Even some of your best battle heroes can be good to have extra on the campaign map. In general, any hero with Assassinate, Block Army, or Assault Unit skills can be especially effective on the campaign map. I believe that's everything we need to start, however, so I'll actually describe and discuss these hero types now. To start, we'll talk about the Melee Hero. Again, it's a very straightforward hero type, and I don't think there's too much to say. They're very similar to the Melee Lord type. There's one of these type of heroes in virtually every roster in the game, and their purpose is to be a melee powerhouse. Many will get mounts, typically an armored horse, sometimes a chariot, maybe a flying mount if you're lucky. But again, we can recognize this hero primarily by their stat line in comparison to other heroes from the roster. Most melee heroes will have very good baseline combat stats and will have a personal skill tree to improve upon them. They will also generally lack any other special skill trees. It's just going to be their personal melee skills plus those campaign skills. Similar to Melee Lords, they're great for dealing damage and absorbing damage too. However, since it's a hero unit, I think you can be a little more reckless with them and use them for a wider variety of situations. You don't have to worry as much if it gets overextended and routes off the battlefield or even dies, because it won't have as big of an impact on the battlefield flow and your army's leadership as your Lord will. They can be used for mobile support and have good utility as a result. The downside is that they just don't do much else. They can do well in win fights if they're high level. They can often take out enemy lords or high priority targets with fairly low risk. In general, they're a good unit to have. It's just that sometimes they aren't really specialized or diverse enough to really suit your needs properly. Now, I want to make an additional note here to talk about the broader scope of the melee hero archetype I've just described and kind of break them down into subcategories like I was mentioning before. I had kind of considered also having a ranged or assassin hero type in this guide as well, because we see just enough of those hero types to consider putting that into the guide. I do think those cases are too few and far between to be made into primary categories. I don't think it will be helpful for you to have those like niche classifications at the top level. However, I do want to mention them here and talk about how I think it operates, at kind of like a subcategory level. The idea is that even amongst melee heroes, we still have examples of heroes with different purposes in battle. The Dark Elf roster gives us some great examples of this. Here we have what are effectively 3 separate melee heroes, which I would argue fall into 3 separate subcategories. The Master, the Death Hag, and the Cainite Assassin all effectively function as this melee hero type. Maybe you would categorize the Master as a support type, but I really don't think they have enough additional skills in their tree. These all also have only the personal melee line in their skill tree with a couple extra skills, but even those extra skills are mostly personal effects. They're not army unit boosting effects, and they're not campaign boosting effects. And especially if we look at the Cainite Assassin, we might ask, what is he? Is this a melee hero? Is this a ranged hero? Is it an assassin? It's why I thought those classifications might be too confusing to try and include at the top level, especially across all the races. Instead, I think we should look at melee hero types as having these kinds of subcategories: anti-infantry, anti-large, or anti-hero. While these are pretty generalized, and most melee heroes can perform more than one of these functions, it's typical for most to perform better at one of these categories than the other, and we can even see that in these 3 example heroes. The Cainite Assassin is effectively anti-hero. I would say it's a melee hero because out of all of these, it has the best melee stats, right? But in addition to the melee stats, it has a high damage missile attack. It has poison contact effect on melee and on missile, slowing down the enemy and decreasing their damage. So this has the ranged attack, poison contact, and solid melee stats, especially melee attack. The Cainite Assassin is effectively an anti-hero melee unit. The Death Hag is effectively an anti-infantry character. It only has melee attacks. It has the anti-infantry bonus on its weapon strength, and it has a bonus of 20 versus infantry, which is a pretty substantial number. It also has additional physical resistance, so despite the low armor, it should be able to take somewhat reduced damage in combat. And it has good enough melee stats to survive in the middle of combat. The Death Hag is effectively an anti-infantry melee hero. The Master, then, is effectively anti-large. Again, it only has melee attacks, but it does have the anti-large bonus at a very substantial number, and that will help make up greatly for its low melee attack while leaving it with enough melee defense to survive the kind of attacks that large units are going to bring. It also has a number of mounts that are going to be effective for tracking down and effectively engaging these large enemy threats. The Master is effectively an anti-large melee hero. So, while these heroes can probably do most of these roles, or more than one, at a high level with a lot of skill points invested, we can see they are somewhat specialized into these subclasses. So when you come across heroes on your own that you might want to categorize as a ranged or assassin type, or even if it is clearly a melee hero type, keep these subclasses in mind as a way to help organize them. Now, with that being said, we should talk about support heroes. In fact, in some of these cases, we might find some of these melee-focused heroes to classify better as support types, or at least see some overlap. The stat line of the Master that we just looked at is a good example where we might look at it as a support hero instead because of the stat line. Well, like I said, I don't think that's quite right because of their abilities, and this is actually a good example of, again, where these categories can sometimes be difficult to navigate through. It's also a good example of how heroes are much more diverse from one race to the next, and their purposes can really vary depending on which race you're playing as and what you're trying to get them to do. In the case of heroes, the support hero is often also has more extreme examples of them having like unique special abilities and lower stats, such that their purpose is to stay out of direct combat and use their abilities to support the army instead. There are also still support heroes where they don't specialize in just one thing and instead are more of a hybrid type, where their abilities can kind of transfer to different things or fill in different niches for you. So part of my point is, I don't think either of those apply to the master, right? It doesn't have, this kind of like balanced set of abilities. It also doesn't have like a really specialized set of abilities for doing one particular thing in support of your army. So we can see this more easily by looking at some of these actual examples of support heroes themselves. I think a great example of highly specialized heroes would be the Gunnery Wight for Vampire Coast, or the Master Engineer for the Dwarfs. The Master Engineer has this restock ability to give additional ammunition to units, which is pretty crazy. This is kind of a cool ability to have. It also has the ballistics calibration skill so that it increases the accuracy and fire rate of artillery. So yeah, this unit has like armor piercing missiles, and if you level it up you can get some other cool stuff, but its skill tree also has increases to ammunition and missile damage for all missile units in your army. So that's what I think makes this, like, clearly, stat line aside, it's clearly a support hero because its abilities are all around, supporting and enhancing the abilities of other units in your army primarily. Another good example of something that's a very specialized hero type is the Necrotect. Their stats aren't, terrible, but I don't really look at this and see, oh yeah, this is clearly a melee hero, right? Even though it's got whip, anti-infantry. What we need to look at is its abilities. And again, here we can see that it's a support type, right? Affects units if unit is a construct. We had a whole list of constructs here for the Tomb Kings. The idea being, and this is a great example of how support lords and heroes are supposed to work, you send this Necrotect into battle alongside two Ushabti. It gives them increased melee attack and armor piercing damage. It gives them armor and missile resistance. It can even restore their health twice over the course of a battle. So you bring this Necrotect not because you're going to send him out into the front lines and get him into melee combat and knock some people out. You bring it instead because paired with these Ushabti units, or really whatever construct you pair them with, because they can also get a mount, they're going to greatly increase the damage output and survivability of those units. So again, in my opinion, clear example of a support unit. We talked about this for the Lord before, but the Warrior Priest hero, same thing. Has area of effect buffs that you want to have this unit engage in combat alongside other units of your own that will benefit from these abilities. There's one last example I want to talk about that I think is a little different, and this is really where we're going to have two subcategories of support heroes. The Lore Master of Hoeth is a great example of kind of a non-specialized hybrid character. Now, we can see despite the fact that it's called a wizard, it has decent melee stats. Like, it has a good stat line here. Anti-infantry, armor piercing, an average of 50 melee attack and defense, 90 armor, and a shield. That's pretty good. And it also will have a personal melee skill tree in the campaign, so you can boost its melee stats even further. However, we see that it has spells, and in the campaign it does have a full spell skill tree for itself as well. So what is this unit supposed to do? What purpose is it supposed to provide for you? Well, I think that is what makes the Lore Master of Hoeth a support unit. You decide what purpose it gives. You can kind of make it into a melee unit, but I think the real value in bringing this is that it's able to fill in the blanks, right? Whatever sort of like empty space or niche that you need filling in your army, this is the unit that can provide it. And this is how that type of support unit functions effectively. You can bring a fire, I have a life mage selected. We could bring a fire mage, has all damaging spells. Oh, but look at this. We can still get heals from this Lore Master. We can still get some other buffs for our ally. We can even get a single target damage spell that would replace Fireball. So you can use this. That's what I mean when I say you can use this to kind of fill in the gaps, right? It can still function as sort of a frontline, line holder unit with its decent stats, but it has these the ability to kind of fill in the blanks. I've said it enough times, so hopefully that makes sense. This means that support heroes can be a little bit harder to recognize and may even have overlap with other subcategories, or even other primary categories. This is something that's made categorizing hero types a bit more challenging than the Lords. However, I still think it's useful to recognize and understand when a hero is meant to play a supporting role rather than an offensive or tank kind of general melee unit role. The strength of these kinds of heroes is either in their versatility or in their specialized function, right? I think the subcategories that we're looking at here are either the highly specialized support type for specific units or purpose in your army, or the generalized support type, which is going to have a variety of uses to cover whatever gaps are left by the rest of your selection. So for some of these heroes, they significantly boost the impact of certain units or features. For others, they just give you unique options how to respond to enemies in battle. Their weakness then correspond to these benefits. Either they serve too niche of a function where if you don't have or don't use whatever units that character is supposed to boost, then the hero is not as strong or outright pointless. Or else, if your hero unit doesn't specialize well enough to be chosen over more specific units or heroes, if they're the versatile support type, then you might just pass over them entirely because you find you don't need them. They're also commonly weaker types that won't excel in combat. Again, with these kind of hybrid types, maybe that's the exception. But in general, if they're caught off guard or you're using them expecting a full-on line holder, you may be risking a lot with them if you put them in the wrong situation. Ultimately, they're still often a good choice, either to round out shortcomings in your roster or to really enhance some of the particular units you've selected. Now, the last remaining hero category is the Spellcaster, and fortunately, this one's a lot easier to recognize and categorize. They're hero units with a magic skill tree. In most cases, they only have the spellcasting tree, though there are some which do still have that kind of melee hybrid type, but even in these hybrid types, I'd often assign them the category of support instead, as they fit into that versatile subcategory. We looked at the Lore Master of Hoth already as an example, but in general, you'll recognize the mage because it has a consistent spell skill tree that has all spells from one type lore of magic. It has kind of pathetic melee stats, and it'll probably have a mount or two with some good mobility. Their strengths and weaknesses are the same as the Lord type. Great capacity for damage, good range over the battlefield to target their abilities, mounts increasing their mobility, but low survivability and a bit of risk and extra micromanagement needed. Some can get pretty powerful mounts in pretty unique, circumstances, but I generally wouldn't say, aside from those unique options, that spellcasters are great in melee. You'd want to choose these to bolster the strength of your army in just about any case. Even if you have a Spellcaster Lord, you might not need to bring a Spellcaster Hero, but there is still potential for them to be worth bringing. And this actually is a good time to bring up one more feature that I think is unique to heroes when it comes to building an army. It is the fact that you can bring multiple of them if you'd like. We don't have that option with Lords, but it is something to consider when it comes to heroes. The important thing to ask is, what are you bringing this hero for? And which of its functions interact with or overlap with other heroes? So, to explain what I mean, let's go back to examples. If we're playing Empire, we're bringing warrior priests for their casualty replenishment, as well as their effectiveness as a support hero in combat. It is useful to bring more than one, but beyond a certain point you have to ask if they are really getting to use their support abilities effectively. I think with this specific unit, some people might argue that this is the best, tanking frontline unit in the roster as opposed to the Empire Captain, and I think that's true more often than not. However, my point here is that when we select a support unit, we must ask, what is it supporting in combat? And then recognize what kind of balance we need to strike between the support hero and the supported units. If we bring all warrior priests, and we bring no spearmen, no halberdiers, great swords or swordsmen, or maybe even cavalry if we put one of these on a mount, it can certainly work for experienced players with a missile-heavy army, but for the sake of this guide, I don't think it's what we should be aiming for, right? If we're bringing a support unit, if we're bringing a support hero, we want 2 or 3 regular combat units to go alongside each support unit that we bring, to get the maximum results from the abilities of that support hero. It's okay to bring more than one of the support hero type, but I don't think that you should bring unlimited. As for melee heroes, I'm less inclined to say that there's really a limit on these. The main reason I'd limit these is to ensure that you have enough to put one or more in each army. They're especially important to have if your lord is going to be a spellcaster or a support type. Having one melee hero or lord in every army at minimum is going to be useful in almost every scenario. I don't think you can really have too many of them unless it's really unbalancing your composition. But of course, with the hero capacity limitations, you want to make sure there's enough to go around. It might depend on your race as well. You may need room for enough of a variety of units that you would want to decrease the amount of melee heroes that you have. But in general, I don't see them having too severe of diminishing returns. In a lot of cases, I would say you want one melee hero for every one support or one spellcaster character type in your army. Now, when it comes to Spellcaster Heroes, I think this is where we can see the clearest result of diminishing returns. The reason for this is because spellcasters all pull from the same pool of winds of magic in a battle. You can slightly increase your magic capacity with each kind of mid to high level spellcaster in an army, and in many cases you can increase your magic recharge time with them too. But in most cases, I don't really find it effective to bring more than 2 Spellcaster Heroes or Spellcaster Hero and Lord total in an army. You might bring 2 just so that you have access to different types of lores of magic if you have some really specific ideas in mind. But the fact is that even one spellcaster at a moderate level can go through a lot of winds of magic in a battle that is drawn out for even a moderate duration. When the spellcaster is leveled up, they'll have access to a lot of different spells, and especially more expensive ones, so you'll have more opportunities to use winds of magic in general. They do get cost reductions at higher levels, so perhaps you can use that to support the argument for bringing another spellcaster. But once you get past 2, you really have to ask how much are you benefiting from that, as opposed to having an additional missile unit or artillery unit in your composition. Because you only really get that 5, we can't see it here, but we can see it here, the 5 winds of magic capacity increase, the arcane conduit for the power recharge. These are the bonuses that you can get for every additional mage you have. But again, we just have to keep in mind they're pulling from that same winds of magic pool. So you're getting a 5% increase in your total winds of magic for double the expenditure rate. It's like if you had all of your archers firing from the same ammunition pool, and each additional archer only increased that ammunition pool by 5%. You'd run out incredibly quickly if you had 10 archers as opposed to only having 1 or 2. So I think that spellcaster types really see the most significant diminishing returns. One of the last little notes I want to make is just a discussion on hybrid heroes. I've talked about it a little already, but I want you to think of these in a similar fashion to hybrid lords. Try to look at their stats, but especially prioritize what you see in their skill tree in the case of heroes. This will help you to determine what their function is in the army and where they would best specialize. Most of these hybrid characters will have some sort of specialization, even if that is ranged damage, and you may not always have to find a niche for them. But if you're confused about what their purpose might be, just keep that same concept in mind, that if it's a ranged melee or a magic melee or whatever type of character it is with multiple abilities, it probably will specialize in something, and that will help you to categorize, with those context clues, what it should be used for and how you can identify that. Now at this point, I've spent a lot of time talking about and explaining how I see different lord and hero types fitting into different categories and subcategories. Now that we have all this information, let's use it to understand how they pair well together and what impact it might have on our unit selection as well. The way I personally see it, it boils down like this. Number 1, you want a Casualty Replenishment hero. If your race has it, you bring it. It really doesn't matter what else is going on. Number 2, you want, at the very least, 1 Spellcaster character if your race has access to magic. Number 3, you want at least 1 or 2 melee characters. For sure, you need 1 melee character to protect every 1 spellcaster type you bring. You might possibly bring 1 melee character for each 1 support or spellcaster character that you are bringing in battle. So let's think back to our Lord selection options again. We've got melee, support, and Spellcaster Lords. If you're confident in your skills, I'd probably recommend a support or spellcaster type Lord. as they'll get the most potential value as a commander. However, the melee can still be a safe pick and still viable, and ensures that you'll meet this one melee character minimum at all times. In addition, it's worth checking out things like their mounts. This might be a factor that can change your decision if the melee lord has a better option than the rest. But so just something to keep in mind, that mounts are worth your consideration as well. I also think it depends on what you're using the army for. For example, I find that an army you're raising primarily for defensive purposes is best suited to have a spellcaster type lord. This is primarily because it means you don't have to add in a spellcasting hero, or really any hero for that matter. If you've just got a half-sized defensive army to assist one of your cities in defending, it's really effective to bring a Spellcaster Lord who can have a couple of spells, can significantly impact the flow of battle without committing a lot to your hero capacity or even committing much to army and army upkeep. It also depends on what units you plan to bring. For example, an army that has a lot of melee units in it might not need a melee lord quite as badly. On the other hand, an army with a lot of missile firepower might have more of a need for additional melee characters to support it. I know that isn't an extensive amount of information in the way of selecting your lord, but with all of the information we've previously discussed while explaining them, you should be able to make an educated decision. You might choose based on your own skill level or playstyle. You might choose based on which hero types your race even has available. Or you might choose based on other benefits like the type of units you want to boost or the type of units you'll be bringing with. So that means we have to figure out what heroes to bring next. The first thing I typically do is counterpick from whatever my lord type is. If I've got a melee lord, I want to bring a spellcaster hero. If I've got a spellcaster lord, I want to bring a melee hero. If I have a support lord, I probably want to bring a spellcaster and a melee hero so that I can get the full benefits of each of these specialized types. From there, it's all about considering these other factors I've discussed and coming to a conclusion that you want. Will you use lots of units that benefit from support characters? Bring 2 or 3 extra support heroes then. Will you have lots of protection but not enough damage? Bring a spellcaster hero then. Are you worried about fighting an enemy who has lots of melee characters? Or maybe you don't have strong melee units of your own? Bring in extra melee heroes then. I did already talk about the diminishing returns of bringing multiple heroes as well, but that shouldn't stop you from at least considering it. The Empire is a faction where some high-level players might recommend that you bring as many heroes to replace your defensive infantry as you can, and I think that that's a suitable option. The Vampire Counts, on the other hand, because of the way their buildings work, are a race that tends to have a lot of extra spellcaster type heroes available to them, so you might want to make different choices with your lord in that regard. Or there's even the High Elves, who have lots of different hero types, and they have those bonus traits associated with them. There you might be bringing extra support heroes to stack together for the bonuses that they give, and being able to use those heroes in battle for specific purposes as well. So with all that being said, I've covered everything I wanted to for this video. I hope that distilling these kinds of character units into distinct categories helps you to organize them better in your mind. The valuation of lords and heroes is a pretty complex feature of Total War Warhammer, and the characters themselves can be very different from one race to the next, so it's hard to tell what to do sometimes. But with the information I've given you here, you should be able to make much more informed and efficient decisions. Knowing what the standout types of characters are and how to pair them well with one another and with your army is a key factor in your success in this game. Now that you have a better idea how all those things work, I'm sure you'll find more success in your own campaigns. If you did enjoy the video, please remember to like and subscribe for more future content. If you have any follow-up questions, please leave them in the comments section below. And if you have any advice of your own or think I missed anything, please add your thoughts as well. As always, thanks for watching, have a great day, and we'll see you on the next one.